We'll let you gotta say got it. I gotta say got it. I'm recording you. Don't worry, I won't put this on Facebook. Okay.
That's good.
Facebook, Instagram for
Instagram. Don't mock me. Like these students mock me all the time. All right, you guys are on. Everybody attentive. Computers off. Cell phones off. And get ready to ask great questions at the end.
I'm ready.
All right, thank you guys.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for having us. My name is Nathan Ho. I work in the office of Mayor Sam Liccardo in the city of San Jose. You probably won't recognize me because most of the time I'm in the background. I would say all the time I'm in the background and of course, supporting our mayor on issues of affordable housing and homelessness. And so happy to talk with you today. And I'm not sure what year you all are. Are you juniors, seniors, a mix?
A little bit of both.
A little bit of both. Okay, great. And this is the social leadership class or?
Servant leadership, baby.
Servant leadership.
Yeah.
Awesome. And so I'm joined today by David Lowe from Destination Home, and I'll go ahead and let him introduce himself.
Awesome. Morning, everybody. Thanks for having us. I'm David Lowe. I'm with Destination Home, which is a nonprofit working to end homelessness in our community. We're a little bit different. We're not like most nonprofits you think of. We're running shelters or providing outreach. We're built to help try to drive big strategies to help end homelessness. So we actually work very closely with folks like Nathan and the mayor, our partners at the county, private business folks who are interested in the solution to think, how can we make a dent in this big issue? And so a little bit about me, I actually used to, before Nathan joined the city, I used to work over there. So I've been in public service a while and really excited to hear that you guys have a class focused on that. And hopefully you guys get to learn something helpful today.
Yeah, great. So I think I can share the screen.
Here. Let me make you
okay.
Co-host. Hold on one second.
Great. Yeah, I don't know, David, do you want to drive this or do you want me to drive it?
I guess I can do it. I think I have probably more of the slides. So
yeah, sounds good. So just at a high level, again, thanks for having us. We want to present to you kind of how we in city government and in the nonprofit sector, we approach homelessness and with the goal of ending homelessness in our county. And so we want to present to you some high level data as well as kind of the structure and context that we approach our policy work to eventually make its way down on the ground. And so David's going to give a lot of the approach here in the county, and then I'll add some of the projects that we're working on in the mayor's office. And then we want to leave ample time at the end for questions. So we'll do about 15 to 20 minutes of presentation, and then the rest of the time will be Q&A and for the rest of the time that we have. So I'll let David kick it off.
Sweet, thanks, Nathan. And I'll say this, that is, we're going to go over some information here. And, there's stuff that if you guys want to get into the weeds, there's so much information, we'll point you to the right resources. But we want to give you an overview. And if, having worked in this space, both from, a city political perspective and now the nonprofit, I think if you leave this talk today with just a couple things, I hope you'll think about is, we all know that the homeless is a big issue here, but that this is not necessarily what we think about when we think of why people are homeless, that this is a big complex issue that really comes back to how we as a community are acting. Two, that if we're going to solve this, we got to figure out a way where that everyone in our community, no matter what they make their background, has access to a safe, affordable home. And the third thing is that there are things happening, even though we have a long way to go to solve it. There is progress stuff the mayor's office working on, we're working on. And if we can get all of you and your families and the community support behind it, we can start taking a step towards solving this. So we're going to roll as we go. Feel free to, I don't know, I guess I'll pause halfway through if we have questions. But again, just kind of listen to it. We'll put links in where you guys can read more if you're interested, because there's a lot of stuff here. But what we always want to start with is just some very basic numbers. One is hard, I'll say this now, is we don't know exactly how many people are homeless in our community. It is really hard to get a measure on it. You can imagine why, right? People are living in creeks, people are in shelters, people are staying with friends for a couple of days before they're out in the streets. But we do try to do kind of a census every 2 years. We had a delay last year's of COVID. And the last count, we had about 10,000 people in our county who were homeless. And as a frame of reference, you might know there's about 1.7 million people who live in Santa Clara County. So we're talking about almost half to 1% of our residents, people who live here, who don't have a home outside or don't have a home and are forced to stay outside or in a shelter somewhere else. And the stat of the right's the other big thing here. You know, you go to other communities, New York City, elsewhere, a lot of cold weather places, there are a lot of shelters, so people will go in night. But out here, just because of a variety of reasons, most of the people who are homeless are outdoors. And that's what we see in the community, right? We see tents and encampments around the freeways, around the creeks. And so this is a really big problem that has grown even bigger over the years. The other thing I like to remind folks is that a lot of times we think of like this is just a problem when you're in the big cities, right? Downtown San Jose, San Francisco, and by for sure that's where the more dramatic examples are. But when we do this count, we look throughout the county, and what you'll see is throughout all of our communities, even our smaller cities, there are people who are homeless. And yes, there are some areas that are bigger than others, but this is a problem that happens throughout our community. And in a minute, we're going to talk about why. There's some big structural factors that are doing on it. So it's very easy for people to say, you know what, it just happens over there. I don't see it in my neighbor. It's not a problem. But if we really dig down, we'll see that there are people struggling to afford housing and ending up on the streets throughout our community. The second big factor goes to I think one of those key big messages is that there is no one profile of what a homeless individual is. I think we all have that stereotype in our mind from what we've seen, you know, when we're out in downtown San Jose or in communities where you see someone who's, you know, certainly pretty poor, also struggling with issues, maybe screaming, right? Might have mental health, might be drunk. And certainly I don't want to deny that there are some inner factors with there. But when we look at the homeless population as a whole, we see that it is much more diverse, just like our own community. And I think the really thing we think it's important to think about is when we think of solutions and why the cause of it, it's not just one thing. It comes down to a variety of factors bigger than any of us that are pushing a lot of people who are really struggling out onto the streets. So a couple key facts in here you can read in your own, but ones that I always find interesting as we break down myths. 80% of people who are homeless here in our county right now lived here before. There's often this perception that people come to California for the sunshine and you'll find a bus out here because it's easier to survive. But really look at it, 4/5 of the people were living here, had a life like you and me, and then something happened. The other really big harmful myth, I think, is this idea that people are living outside want to be outside. And, you know, really, again, you will run into somebody who wants that. But almost 90% of people would love to be in housing or interested in housing, but they just can't afford it or find one that meets their needs. You can see a lot else there too. I think when you get smaller down, you'll see, but there are a lot of different things that get to it, right? What causes homelessness? Divorce, job loss, eviction, people with disabilities. It includes children, veterans, people of all races. And so we really had to make ourselves that we're not buying into the stereotypes. And that's just good for our own awareness. But the reason when we start talking about solutions and how we solve it helps us really think about what the core of the issue is. And so what is the core of the issue? You know, I did just say that there are a lot of reasons that go into homelessness, and that's absolutely true. But as we've had a lot of academic research in it, and I've been actually reading up a lot more about it over the past years, we realized that any individual person's homelessness can be caused by a variety of factors, right? Maybe they did have trouble with drugs. Maybe they did lose a job. A lot of different things that go into it. But the core of it, when you look at it, a big issue is that we as a community have created a infrastructure, a system that pushes people into homelessness. And by far, the academics who look at this number one reason of why some communities have more homelessness than others, why it exists in our country. And it's the fact that in a lot of places, what the rents are, how much it costs to have a home is way out of reach for people who are at the lowest income scale. So this is a chart that some of our friends in the statewide put together. It's about Santa Clara County. You can see that to afford what an average apartment is here in our community is about $55 an hour. You got to make that, which is a pretty good wage. And look at all these other jobs that are, you know, lower paid jobs, but we all know people who do this: janitors, cleaners, teachers on there, medical assistants are just not nearly making enough to make the average rent. And what that means is they got to find cheaper places. Those don't always exist. And even if they can find a cheaper place, you can see that a lot of people are spending way too much of their money on rent. Kind of golden standard is you pay about 1/3 of your income on rent. But when you talk about people who are severely rent burdened, what this chart is, these are people who are putting more than half of their income into rent and utilities. And you can see the people, there's some acronyms on here that you probably don't understand, but basically the left is people who are making about average income, and all the way to the right are people who are making very little income. When you're talking about the people who have the lowest incomes in our community, most of them are putting more than half their money to rent. And that's if they can find an affordable place. A lot of them can't at all, and that's why we see people out on the streets. So there's a lot more detail on here. We'll put some links in afterwards where you can read more about it. But I always want to strive back to this because yes, any individual person, why they end up homeless is going to be a variety of factors. But the reason we have this at all, and we didn't have a lot of homelessness here in America until the 70s or 80s, was because we didn't have this dynamic of where it was just really too expensive for a lot of people to live. And we certainly know that's the case here in the Bay Area. So I'm going to kick it over to Nathan in a minute, but a little big framing. I just told you the bad news and we all know why. And we all know that there is some bad news and kind of some context about why. But the reason I'm doing this work after spending a lot of time is because there is hope. We have a big problem that was decades in the making. We're not going to get overnight, but we do know what the solution is. We're not hopeless. And there's a lot of things we need to do to address homelessness in the community. But the number one thing I think I want you guys to take away if you think about this is it's as simple as it sounds. Housing is the solution, right? People who are homeless, what we need to make sure that people are not homeless is make sure there are homes for them. And how we do is a little bit more complicated, but that's the sense of it, right? If we can make sure there's enough homes and there are homes for people of all incomes and backgrounds, we can change this dynamic. So our organization, as Nathan mentioned, works very closely with the city and other partners, and we all together every 5 years come together behind this, what we call a community plan to end homelessness. And we talk to a lot of people out there, experts, nonprofit everyday providers, everyday residents, and think about what is it we see in our community and how are we going to come together to end homelessness. And this community plan, which I'll also put a link to, is pretty deep. You can look at your own thing, but it comes down to a number of different strategies that all together we hope will make the needle where people don't have to sleep outside anymore. And while there are a lot of things we're doing, it really comes down to that first thing I said before. It's this housing first strategy, because we have a lot of things we got to do, but we know that if we can make sure that folks of all ages, incomes, and abilities have access to housing they can afford, we can thrive. And this is based on the idea that that is that core issue of what we need to solve. And even though people have all sorts of issues, particularly if you've been on the streets for a while, that is the core. If we can get people housed, we can talk about how we make sure you are more physically healthy, mentally healthy, employment, making sure you're back with your family. But none of this works if you don't have a home. And so it's something that we think is really critical to how we're going to address people of all diversity who may be having issues maintaining their stability. Big question is, does it work? There's a lot of things of what is the right way. We will often hear about, hey, if we just had more mental health help and substance abuse treatment, we can solve homelessness. Those things help, but we need to have a place for people to go. And what we found is, this is a stat for when we have permanent housing, people have been on the streets forever, 96% of the time, they're going to stay housed. And that just shows if we can find people with the right environment where to live, not only are they going to stay housed, but they're going to be on a path to helping be more successful, healthy, and thrive in our community. The other thing I'd like to point out just really quickly, there's a whole study on it, but we looked at it. How can this make fiscal sense? Because, it takes money to build housing, have housing programs. But one thing we found with a pilot was called Housing 1,000 is for people who've been homeless a long time, they take up a lot of resources just being on the streets. You have 911 calls. Sometimes the police come out to it. They're going to end up in the emergency room a lot. And so they have a lot of drain on what we call county services. But what we did is we housed a bunch of those people as part of this pilot, and we looked at how much were they taking up in services before and afterwards. And what you can see, there was this huge reduction on how much it affects the rest of our community. And in many cases, that reduction is less than it would cost to help them get into housing. So we find it's a really cost-efficient strategy as well. And then the last thing I'll just leave you with before I hand it over to Nathan, who's going to tell you a lot of great stuff that the city and our other political leaders are working on to move this progress forward, is just remembering what we're talking about. And, with our work, we're helping connect thousands of people to housing every year. And we do get some of the stories. And it's just important to remember that, right? We're talking about folks, real people, real families whose lives are really struggling outside. And, when we get to the end of the presentation, we'll talk about some things you can do. But I think besides just educating yourself on the issue, keeping that remember, we hear so much bad stuff out in the world, vitriol out there, but if we remember this as human beings, it can all help us think of how we're going to come back towards solutions. So I'll go ahead and pause there. Nathan, do you want to go straight into it and we'll take questions after that?
Yeah, I think that's probably the best way. We'll take questions at the end. And so be sure to be writing down questions. If there are stats that didn't quite make sense to you, we can circle back to them. And so thank you, David, for all that great information. I just want to share briefly kind of how I started into this work. I actually was in health policy, and how that came about is I grew up growing up in the East Bay, out in the suburbs, and my parents chose a church in Oakland, Chinatown to go to every Sunday and every Friday. And that was kind of my exposure because we didn't have it in homelessness in the East Bay. I wasn't as a parent. And so we would go into Oakland every week, and I would see what that would look like. That was, of course, many decades ago. And now where we are, because of the lack of investment from both the federal, state, and local funding sources into solving and ending homelessness is what we have today of folks who can't afford to live and either starting to, usually it starts with, I'm going to live in a car for a little bit because I got evicted and couldn't pay rent for 1 month, because I either got sick or in between jobs. And, that's a temporary solution that then turns into a long-term solution for many folks, because once you get into that hole, it's very hard to dig yourself out given the structures that we have. And so on the next slide here, just want to thanks, David. We hear a lot in the news, and especially from politicians, anyone who says, quote, all we have to do to solve homelessness is ... end quote, is either trying to mislead you intentionally or is misinformed, or both. There is no silver bullet in this. This is why it's difficult work and why we love partners like Destination Home and David with his experience in the mayor's office and now there at Destination Home, really moving us forward and coordinating the efforts. And it takes not just the tools that we have in our toolbox currently, but we have to come up with new tools as well to address this, because there is not one profile, as David said, of someone who is homeless or unhoused in our community. And so what this is just showing is this a variety of housing solutions, because while there is no silver bullet, we know that bringing someone in from the outside without a roof over the head, being unsheltered, is the solution, right? To go from unhoused to housed, we need housing. And so there's a variety of solutions that we're pushing forward. My work began on the far right side in the orange around building affordable housing. This is something that has been called a number of various things, but essentially it is great looking housing that local governments, state governments, and federal governments put funding into in order to build. You probably won't know the difference between affordable housing development and a market rate housing development, because they're built to look the same and to be the same. In the purple there is the end all. That is the goal that we're moving toward, what we call permanent supportive housing. This is housing that is just normal housing like apartments, but there are on-site services, mental health, substance abuse, occupational services, employment services to help folks reintegrate into society. For those of us who do camping, this is a very crass parallel, but just wanted to add it from my background. We go camping for a week or two, and then you come back into society. There's a little bit of jolt, right, of coming back to technology and people and jobs, the busyness of just kind of how the world moves. And just picture being decades or even a year or two out in the streets without people making eye contact with you, trying to stay away from you, moving to the other side, that there is a great deal of social isolation that occurs by being outside, that it has a bearing on health and mental health. And so permanent supportive housing, again, is that housing that has that supportive services to help folks reintegrate into society. And we'll go to the next slide here. In 2016, Dave and I helped to move forward what's called Measure A in this county. Santa Clara County has been great in terms of basically taxing ourselves to raise funds in order to build permanent supportive housing in our county. And so you'll see a number of the developments throughout the county that have been built since 2016. The goal with that money was about 4,000 units or 4,000 homes for people to live in, and that would make a meaningful impact into what we're doing. Next slide is, it's great that we have Measure A, we're moving forward. As you may know, it takes some time. When I was building affordable housing, working for a nonprofit, it sometimes could take 5 to 10 years. For those of you who are driving down or up Highway 17 in Los Gatos off of Lark Avenue, that was one of my very first projects, working for a nonprofit called Eden Housing at the North 40 in Los Gatos. Many of you know that that's been vacant for a very long time. That project took about 10 years from beginning of, we want to build housing there to actually getting a shovel into the ground and building affordable housing there, along with all the other market rate housing there. A lot of lawyers were involved to get there, to get where we are. But, that's 10 years. And I think our project was 100 or so senior housing units. And so you can see that because it takes so long, and that is the goal, and you want to keep doing it, there's a need. And what we've been doing in the mayor's office is looking at interim solutions. So while we are building permanent housing, there are still people who are unsheltered. In the city of San Jose, we have about 6,000 folks on a given night who are sleeping in our creeks and on our streets and outside. And so while we're building the permanent housing so that they will have a home to go to, we need something that is cheaper or more economical and faster as a bridge between the streets and permanent housing. And so during the pandemic, usually during an emergency, we will put folks into a convention center, or if there's a flood or earthquake, everyone comes together and has a place to stay if they don't have a home. That doesn't work during a pandemic. We didn't want, as we all know, we were all told to shelter at home, shelter in place. For those who don't have a home, we didn't want to bring them into one place so that they would be exposed to the coronavirus. And so Mayor turned to our team and said, we need to build homes and fast. And so we used some of our Coronavirus emergency funding to build essentially what we called growing up portables. I'm not sure if they're still called portables at schools, but I had many classes in portables. Essentially, it is what we call a modular factory built, kind of like a trailer that we have 4 bedrooms in with a bathroom. And so this is individual, what we call non-congregate housing. This was a loop down at Bernal in Monterey that you can see in the top right-hand corner was just an empty space where there were some trees and there was trash in there. And folks said, well, you can't build housing around a loop. And we said, we're going to try. And so our first project is here at Bernal in Monterey in South San Jose. This is 80 units or 80 bedrooms for 80 individuals to come in from the cold and have a place to stay. Again, this is interim housing. This is not the permanent supportive housing, which is the gold standard that we're moving towards. This is to give someone essentially a shelter space that is not in a tent or in a bunkhouse, that they have their own bed and their own bathroom and have a lock and key. that is pivotal to folks to feel humane, to feel like it's an actual home that is their own. So we'll go to the next one. This is right next to Highway 101 off of Silicon Valley Boulevard. Again, this is state land, Caltrans land that no one thought to build housing on. And so we said, well, we want to build interim housing on here that would be temporary. All these units can be moved off just like they were moved on. There's infrastructure and plumbing and electricity that we built and paid for in there. But again, this is 120 beds to allow for 120 couples and individuals to come in. During the pandemic, we built these anywhere from 4 months to 8 months, when something like a typical apartment building can take up to 3 years to build. That's just the construction part, let alone trying to get all the approvals from city governments and all the funding. And so this is called Rue Ferrari. It's off of, again, in the left-hand corner, you can see what was there. It's a big empty field leading onto the on-ramp. And we said we think we can get some homes there. And we've got, again, 120 homes there. The next slide. And so these are what we call emergency interim housing communities. It's a mouthful, but it's to delineate this type of housing from permanent supportive housing, again, which is the more apartments permanent. And so on the left is what we currently have. And on the right is our next project. We're building this off of Branham in Monterey in kind of southwest San Jose. And we're going to start stacking them. And so instead of just having one story, we said, well, land is so scarce in the Silicon Valley, can we go vertical a little bit? And can we think around perhaps converting this to permanent supportive housing, even though there's single rooms that are not the highest need or demand for those? Can we eventually convert this? And I think what David is doing there with the cursor is this is this is right up against single family homes and townhomes. So you can imagine the neighborhood wasn't necessarily happy, but there are about 12 individuals with very large tents who are currently encamped on this land. And so the neighbor said, well, we can bring those folks in, then we want to be part of the solution too. That's not everybody. We still get a lot of vitriol and emails of folks who don't want it. But there are a good number of folks who say, we want to be part of the solution. We'll go to the next slide. So David, do you want to speak briefly about this, or I can as well?
Sure. And you caught me because I was not trying to show anything with this cursor, but I forgot that you guys can see my cursor. So, we got a lot of information. We'd love to take your questions and, hear what you say. But I think, if we think of three things you guys can do if you want to get involved afterwards. One is, we just hit the tip of the iceberg here, right? There's so much information out there. This is a complex issue. The premise is simple, what causes homelessness and how we solve it. But there's so many other details that Nathan was starting to get into now. So educate yourself. There's a lot of resources out there. One thing we did at Destination Home was create a section that had a lot of the data we shared here to help people kind of get a better understanding of it. So that's just one of the many resources out there. And I encourage you guys on your own to really understand this issue, because I think the crib notes and the cheap talking points you hear out there doesn't get to the depth of this, right? It really doesn't. So we hope just by folks understanding this better, we'll be in a better spot. Second, there's a lot of things that you and your families can do to help those who are unhoused. And there's just a couple of different ways. I think it's something for you guys to think about if you want to get involved. Certainly people are living outside, always in need for food and clothes. I would encourage you, instead of trying to organize your own, find organizations that have done it, because it's a lot of work on logistics and there's also better and more efficient ways to do it. But certainly there are always these great nonprofits who need help for that, or volunteers to help with it, right? Whether you're actually contributing those items or actually helping distribute it. I think the third one here, maybe the most important one of these assist those is it's the golden rule, which you guys have heard since you were kids. But there's a real temptation when people are struggling for us to think of them not as one of us, right? Not as another human being. And that's just not true, right? These are people who are really in a really struggling time. And, when we talk to a lot of people who are experiencing homelessness or come out of it, a lot of times what they say is, like the hardest thing beyond not having somewhere to sleep is just feeling like you're invisible, feeling like everyone is giving you the evil eye and all of that. So I there's not a specific ask here other than we are all going to continue to come across people who are homeless in our lives and think how you're treating them, thinking about how, instead of scurrying across the street or kind of even look in the eye, or if they say something, saying hello back to them. Just, whatever that is, where that's comfort level, remember this is a human being and how you would want to be treated if you were struggling too. And then the third thing I'll leave you with, if those of you who are as passionate as Nathan and I are about ending homelessness, is there is a role for the community to play. And there's a lot of things you can do, but I think the number one thing we can do is think of how you can advocate for solutions. Every week at the County Board of Soups, at the state legislature, the city council, they are debating different things that have an impact on homelessness. And your advocacy, the community's advocacy, makes a difference, because there's a lot of problems we have to solve as a community. And unfortunately, people who are homeless do not have a loud voice for this, right? They are just trying to survive. And so we as a community can speak up for them and the solutions that can help for them. And in particular, it's this last point that Nathan made, we know the solution to homelessness is more housing, whether it's affordable housing, tiny homes, modular interim units, like Nathan said, more shelters, more services. But the number one barrier onto that is that there are people in the community who say, no, we don't want it here. And I think a lot of that is based in the fear because they haven't educated themselves on it. And so we are always really trying to find supporters out there who want to say, we believe in ending homelessness. We want more housing, because otherwise it's just going to be that much longer until we solve this problem. And it's one of those many dynamics that have gotten us here in the first place.
Okay. So there's a lot of information that David and I did not touch upon, given the time, and we assume that the questions will probably go that way. But there's a lot of other issues around encampments and trash, the visible symptoms, I guess you can call it, of homelessness, not only homelessness, but illegal dumping. When people see encampments, they think, well, I don't want to wait till trash day to throw out that couch. I don't know why. I'll just donate it to the folks down at the encampment, and then all of a sudden you get a trash pile that starts up. We can go deep into that, but didn't want to focus a lot of what of our presentation on that. A lot of the work that we do is advocacy at both the state and local level, state and federal level for funding. Up until about 5 years ago, 6 years ago, the state did not give any money to cities to deal with homelessness. And so we've had a great success in getting local funding, given the leadership of our big city mayors, of which Mayor Liccardo was chair the past 2 years. And we're just getting ramped up to really start moving forward solutions. And so we're available for questions. I think you guys are out at 10:45. I can stay on until 10:45, and so we'll take those questions as you have them.
Cool. Okay, let's rock. Here we go. Who wants it? Who wants the first one? You guys have been writing, so quickly, come on. Jacob.
First off, like I have a few questions, but one that kind of goes with all of them is, are you giving them the housing, like the opportunity to just get a house, and like, or are you giving them the opportunity to basically buy a house with rent and all that kind of stuff? It's just less than what it would be with the like other housing.
Great question. Yeah, great question. And the short answer is it's the second one, right?
Okay.
Almost all of these things we're talking about will most of these are not buying, right? It's renting, but that folks will contribute a part of their income. The problem, as we said before, is right, they can't afford what a normal rent will be. So we build this in a way where we take a part, they can contribute a part of their income, but make sure they have enough, funding for food and other things along the side.
And
no,
go ahead.
Yeah, one point on that is the calculation is 30% of your income should go to housing or rent. The other 70% is not just play money. That is money that goes towards medicine, healthcare, food for the families who are unhoused out there. Many parents are forgoing meals in order to feed their kids. And those are choices that we feel as a value for our community. That's why we provide affordable housing. The little caveat that David said is the modular housing for interim housing that we're doing is shelter. And so shelter is not the permanent housing that we're moving towards, which is based off of that rent that folks pay rent into that. That is just to get folks off the street in order for that they can be in the queue, in the line to get that permanent housing going forward. But that's a great question. And there are a lot of misinformation out there that we're just giving away $1 million homes to people. And that is not the case.
And I actually have another question about like the housing and stuff. Like, now when they get into the house, do they have to be clean to get into the house, or can they still do substance abuse and that kind of thing, even in the house that you're providing? Because I love that, but at the same time, for me personally, my family has history of substance abuse, and I would hate for that kind of to be allowed. So, or is there, and also, do you provide mental illness like areas and things like that? Do you provide that kind of stuff, or is that more up to them? I guess, how hands-on are you with that kind of situation, rather than them just going, or rather than you guys just going, okay, we're going to build this house, it's less money, go have fun? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, that's a great, yes, that you hit it right on the money. One of the most difficult questions that we deal with. Dave, do you want to tackle it first, and I'll pile on?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question. And I'll start by answering saying is when we talk about all these different housing types, different ones will have different rules. But for the most part, when we talk about the housing we're building, there is not mandatory a requirement for you to be clean before you go in or right when you go in. And there's a reason for that, which I'll explain, which doesn't always make sense when you think about it. But what we have found, it goes back to that housing first philosophy, is you got to get someone inside first before you can help them think about resolving their issues. It is really hard. And I think about this myself. If I were ever unfortunate to be homeless on the street, I can understand why people are going to be thinking about using drugs or alcohol, right? It's a miserable experience. And so what we found is if we can get people inside first, you can start having all of those services you talk about. With the answer is yes, right? Mental health, substance abuse, just regular healthcare, job, employment, family reunification, those services that will help you get clean and sober and back on your life. So that's part of it. I also say that this strategy means that they're also voluntary. We want to make sure people come back at their own pace. Nathan made the analogy of, right, when you're first coming indoors, it is very jarring for people. So unfortunately, it's one thing if you've been out in the streets for a couple months and you're lucky enough, you can get housed pretty quickly. A lot of people have been out there for years. So we recognize that's a longer road for how we get folks back to health.
Okay.
Back to healthy. Nathan, I don't know if you want to add anything on that.
Yeah, that's spot on. And I just want to point out that it's housing first and not housing only. right? So back to my initial point of, if someone says all we have to do is give housing to these people, that is probably a misinformed a statement, because it's not just housing, it's housing first, and then all the services and programs are wrapped around this person and available to this person. For those of us who have gotten into a lot of the substance abuse programs, if you force someone to go through it, the success level is very, very low. Something like that is not, someone has to willingly and voluntarily go into that mindset to come off of substance abuse, and you can enforce them as much as you want and even make housing contingent about it, and that's a losing battle for everyone, because eventually they'll have to leave housing, and because they're not following the rules, and they're back on the street, and we have this vicious cycle of folks who are just being perpetuated in homelessness because we aren't addressing the root cause of not just their housing instability, but also their mental health and substance abuse. And so there's a lot of chatter going on, both on social media and in the media right now. And the reason why it's not immediately clear is because it's complicated. It's not just that, well, we should put rules on. If they don't follow the rules, then what? They're back on the street, and we're not. We haven't solved anything for both our community and that person. And so, but it's complicated. There was an article written recently within the last week around, is housing first working or not? It's good in theory, and it is absolutely the policy that we are moving forward with. But if executed half-heartedly, and it is only just, housing first, and we have some staff on site who are there to kind of, be concierges and to just look after them, rather than truly getting them the help that they need, it won't work. If it's housing only, it won't work. It's got to be housing first, and then the services that come behind it. Now, there's a resources question that comes with that too, because the services actually, in the end, are more expensive to fund than the actual housing. And so that's a lot of what our current push and advocacy is at the state level. Is we love capital funds, we love construction funds, but we also need operating and maintenance funds that covers those services that are so necessary once we bring someone in from the cold.
Now, my last question that kind of goes with that one is so what are you guys kind of doing to discourage, I get that you don't have to be clean, but what are you guys doing to discourage them from just bringing in the things that they were doing on the street? Let's say that they weren't able to afford, right, a regular house, right, and that kind of thing, which you guys provided a great way for them to afford a home for the moment, or let's say long term, hopefully, that kind of thing. What discourages them from just bringing in the things that they were doing on the street, let's say drugs, alcohol, that kind of thing, into the home, and staying at the low cost of your home and never actually getting to the more productive side of society?
Yeah, it's a great question. This may not be the satisfying answer, but we do see that most people will take advantage of the services when they have there, because most people want to get their lives back together and they know that's a problem. Some of them won't. And for those who don't, again, there's not anything to it. That'd be a small percentage. But the big thing is that these, they still have to follow all the rules that you'll have if you have a lease in your own apartment, right? So conceivably, someone, if they're, they're still abusing, but they're in their home, they're not causing issues, that could happen. But there are other things we need to make sure it's not a danger to the broader community, the people there, that's not having that kind of behavior. And the other thing I'll mention too is when we talk about a lot of this housing and this permanent supportive housing with services, these are a lot of people who are who have a disabling condition or unhealthy and other things. So there are other challenges that they're really doing to try to have their lives get back together. And this is one of them that we're going to have to, help them get through. But these are also folks too who are likely going to take a longer road to get back there.
Okay.
Yeah, I would say that the offset to isolation, again, these folks have been isolated from community, is community and connection. And so I'm not saying that the silver bullet is just to bring people together and all of a sudden substance abuse goes away. But that first part of being connected to someone who actually cares around your outcomes beyond yourself helps overcome some of that shame as an individual, shame of not being able to stop, even if they want to. A lot of the drug use is not about at least with the folks that I talk to. That's anecdotal, not data driven. But the folks I speak to say, you know, they don't take drugs because they get that high and they feel good. They take drugs at this point because they are addicted to just stave off those cravings, right? To feel normal. And a good number of the folks I meet, the vast majority actually start drug use once they become unhoused, because it's the only way to deal with the toxic environment of constantly feeling like someone's out to get you, someone's out to take your stuff. For many of the vulnerable populations, like women and children out there, it's the only way they have to deal with constantly feeling that their life is being threatened while they're out there. And so again, we're not batting 1,000 when it comes to bringing people in, but we find that this is the best way to at least get the good outcomes that we're getting, to give folks housing first, and then we can get them the services, the programs they need it. I don't want to put that in rose lenses to say it always works. I was talking to a service provider recently. They said it could take anywhere from 15 to 20 times of approaching someone over the course of a few months to get them to finally say, okay, I'll come meet with you. Because there's so much distrust in the system, as well as of themselves, to really seek the help that they need. But they wouldn't be able to eventually get there if it were not for the housing.
Yeah. What, we probably have one more question, but really quick, how do you guys, so you have city and a nonprofit partnering together. I imagine that's one of these solutions, is like, how do you guys partner together with other places like Life Moves or City Team or Sacred Heart, or how does that all work in the city? What are you seeing?
Yeah, those folks that you mentioned are the boots on the ground. Those are the folks who are out doing outreach and getting the folks that they need. They're the ones who are running our interim housing, our shelters, and providing the services at permanent supportive housing. The great thing about Destination Home is before all this, there was this, all of us doing what we thought was best. Nobody was coordinating it. And so what David does, probably oversimplifying, but one of the great benefits of what Destination Home does is they actually coordinate all of us together to say, we're all moving in the right direction. And we are the envy of every county in California, if not across the country, because we have Destination Home that has great supporters like Cisco, and many of the private companies that are out there, along with the city partnering, saying, and meeting together saying, is what we're doing working or not? And we're data driven, as David said. 96% of folks who enter through the Housing First strategy here in the county, if given the right services, remain housed. The article I mentioned recently looked at Southern California, where many of the folks were exiting the housing back into homelessness after 1 year. And that's because they got the housing only and the services were low. So that's a great question, but we all do work together, and it's going to take us and the community as a whole to get there.
That is amazing. That's so cool to hear. And you guys all hear that? You all get that? Yeah. Because they've heard from different people like that. So it's so cool that it's all working together. All right. You hear the rustling of the backpacks.
I remember that.
Everybody has to go pretty soon. So I think we'll say thank you. And this is so great. I appreciate you both so much. Everybody, round of applause, please.
Thanks. We appreciate it. Look forward to engaging in the future.
Thanks, guys. Have a good rest of your day.
Thanks.
You guys. See you guys.
Thank you.